This is Kathy from GadgetStop321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Montblanc Swan Illusion. Now, as I started doing my writing samples for Swan Illusion, I just figured it would be like the brown version of Oyster Gray. It seems like the same type of ink, like a watery, low saturation ink, but there are a few differences and a surprise or two. So I'm going to be testing this ink out in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And this first writing sample will be on Tomoe River paper. Okay, I'm going to begin with my Pilot 78G with a stainless steel extra fine nib. Let me do my little swatch here. And it feels pretty dry, kind of like the Oyster Gray did. And it feels pretty dry and scratchy, and it's not very legible. It's pretty pale. So it's scratchy. All right. And for the fine nib, I switched it up. On the Oyster Gray, I tried it in my my Sailor Pro Gear Slim, and it didn't do well. So I assumed it probably wouldn't do well. The Swan Illusion wouldn't do well. And so I'm trying it in my Platinum 3776, and this was one of the surprises. I had mentioned yesterday that the Sailor and Platinum fine nibs probably wouldn't be a good idea, but this Platinum fine nib seems to be putting down a little more ink, and that's helping out. The legibility is much better than the extra fine. There's still some feedback, but for me, I have used fine nibs quite a bit, and this doesn't bother me. I'm gonna say that I like it. I would use it, but for most people, I'll say it's okay. But there's feedback, a significant amount of feedback. But I like it. And one of the things, I like this color ink with this black and gold. It's got a kind of a retro feel to me. It feels kind of 70s. All right, my next pen is the TWSBI Mini. This has a very smooth, fine nib, and it did okay with the Oyster Gray yesterday. And this is it's not a wet writer. I wouldn't say that this TWSBI Mini is a dry writer, but I wouldn't classify it as a wet writer. So I am feeling some feedback, or it feels dry, but it's not to the point that it's unpleasant. And you can hear it. So it's dry, but it's okay. Usable by my standards. And yesterday, the pen that stood out as performing the best was my Pilot Stargazer that has a 14 karat medium nib. In my experience, the Pilot gold nibs write pretty wet and are pretty smooth, and so that works well with this ink. This is a medium nib. Pretty wet. And it's good that this is a really smooth nib because I'm not feeling dryness, and I wouldn't even call it feedback, but there is an increased amount of friction with the paper. And to me, that's a good thing. I don't particularly like a glassy smooth nib. I like just a little bit of friction. It gives me some control. It doesn't feel like my, pen's about to slide off the page. Okay, next I have a Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Now I mentioned that the Pilot Gold nibs, in my experience, tend to write kind of wet, but this cursive medium nib is pretty dry. And this ink, yeah, I don't like it in this nib. Feels very dry. And it just doesn't look great either. Very pale. Okay, so this is dry and unpleasant. And I didn't label my Stargazer. I'm going to go ahead and put, out of all of these nibs, this is the smoothest. Very pleasant to write with. And finally, I've got my Ginhou X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. Oops. And in this really wide, wetter nib, this looks like watered down hot chocolate. Like hot chocolate in a packet that you make with water and you don't put any milk in it. Looks kind of watery. That's what this looks like. All right, while that dries, I'm going to take a look at some of the other writing samples. So this is Tomoe River paper. This is the best paper. My mid-tier paper is Rhodia. And just like on the Tomoe River paper, yeah, the fine nib was scratchy. It feels dry in the finer nibs, and in the if you have a pen that's kind of a dry writer, it's just going to feel dry. Just like the Oyster Gray, the best pen to use is a pen with a nice wet medium, or even, let me see, this one was okay. If you have a dry nib, as long as it's super smooth, it will be usable. On my 20-pound copy paper, this was kind of a surprise. The Oyster Gray had performed so well yesterday. Even in the wetter, wider nibs, it didn't feather. But Swan Illusion does tend to kind of spread out just a little bit, but just enough that it's in the wider nibs, it makes it not as pleasant to use. Now, this was kind of surprising. Let me see. Yeah, just like on the other paper, the platinum was really nice. There was some feedback with the TWSBI Mini. It was dry, but it felt okay to write with. It wasn't horrible. So this ink, it's not as great on poor quality paper as the Oyster Gray. The Oyster Gray was a nice ink to use on poor quality paper. And let's see, it seems like the Swan Illusion is bleeding through just ever so slightly more. Yeah, the medium bled through a little bit more than the Oyster Gray. All right, on my Leuchtturm, these two inks are just velvety, flat inks, these two Montblancs, velvety and flat, and they just look nice. You have that little slight halo of dark ink around the edges, just a little bit of shading here and there. it's just a nice classy looking ink, especially on this cream colored paper. I liked it in a wetter nib. All right, and back to the Tomoe River paper. Again, I liked it in the Pilot Stargazer in the medium, the wet medium nib, but this one, it did okay in the platinum, and that makes me think I probably need to try Oyster Gray in the platinum fine nib. I guess, and I noted this yesterday, that the side strokes in the Pro Gear Slim felt dry, and I would have to go back and check my notes. Whenever I did a writing sample with my custom 74 with a fine nib and the platinum and the Sailor fine nib, I bet Sailor is the driest of the three. So, all right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.